Settlers of Catan is a 3 to 4 player board game where players try to collect resources and build a civilization to earn victory points. The first player to earn 10 victory points wins the game. Players get 1 victory point for each settlement they build, 2 victory points for each city they build, 2 victory points if they build the longest road, and 2 victory points for assembling the biggest army. There are also development cards that can give players victory points. To set up the game, first shuffle the hexagonal terrain pieces face down. Then, randomly flip them over and make them into a hexagon made of 19 terrain pieces. There are 5 terrain types in Catan, including hills, forest, mountains, fields, pasture, and desert. Next, place the numbered water cards around the outside of the hexagon by placing 1 water hexagon against every other terrain with the numbered side facing in towards the center. Fill in the blank spaces between the numbered water cards with the blank water cards. Now, randomly place the numbered tokens on the terrain spaces, skipping the desert and water spaces. Place the robber token on the desert. The terrain spaces produce resources and provide cards that you collect to help you build. The hills make brick, forest makes lumber, mountains make ore, fields make grain, pasture makes wool, and desert doesn't produce anything. Separate these resource cards into separate piles and set them face up next to the board. Shuffle the development cards and place them face down next to the resource cards. Every player picks a color to play and takes the road, settlement, and city pieces for their color. Each player rolls the dice, and the player who rolls the highest number goes first. Play moves clockwise around the table. On the first turn, players set 1 settlement at any intersection where 3 terrain hexes meet, and 1 road on an adjacent line leading away from their settlement. Players may not place their first settlement on a junction that is adjacent to another player's settlement. Then, going in reverse order, players place an additional settlement and road. Next, each player receives 1 resource card for each terrain that their second settlement borders. For example, if a player's second settlement is at the junction where a mountain hex meets 2 forest hexes, they would take 1 ore card and 2 lumber cards. Now, the player that placed the first settlement goes first. To start a turn, the active player rolls 2 dice. The combined number on the dice determines which terrain hexes produce resources for that turn. For example, if a player rolls a 6, every hex with a token that says 6 on it makes its resource. Any player that has a settlement in an adjacent junction gets 1 resource card for that numbered hex. If you have a city in the junction, you get 2 resource cards. There are no hand size limits, but if a player rolls a 7, the players with more than 7 resource cards discard half of their resource cards. Also, when a 7 is rolled, the player that rolled it gets to move the robber token to any hex on the board. The robber covers the numbered hex, and that terrain produces no resources for as long as the robber stays there, even if the numbered token is rolled on the dice. If there is a settlement or city on a junction where the robber is moved, the player that moved the robber chooses 1 card at random from the owner's hand and steals it. After the dice have been rolled and resource cards have been distributed, the active player can trade resources with other players, trade with the bank, or buy something. They can do any combination of these things on their turn. Any player trades are legal, so long as both players agree. However, players cannot trade development cards. To trade with the bank, players must exchange 4 identical resource cards for 1 card of any type. If a player controls a settlement on a port junction, which is a port on a corner of a numbered water hex, They can use the ratio listed on that water hex to exchange resources with the bank instead. For example, the player has a settlement or city on the corner of the water hex that says 3-1. They can trade 3 resource cards instead of 4 to get another card from the bank. If there is a specific resource symbol on the port, that ratio only applies to trades for the matching resource. Players can also buy something on their turn. To buy a road, settlement, or development card, players follow the key on the building cost card to pay the bank for their piece. For example, a player can pay 1 brick and 1 lumber to build a road. When a player buys a piece, they place it on the board immediately. Roads must be placed on a line between hexes and must connect to another road, settlement, or city the player owns. Players can only build 1 road on each line. If they have the longest road in the game, and it is at least 6 pieces long, they get the longest road card, which is worth 2 victory points. If someone else builds a longer road over the course of the game, they get that card. To build a settlement, a player must place it on an intersection between hexes that is connected by at least 1 road. They may not place a settlement on any junction where there is an existing settlement, and each adjacent junction must be empty for the player to place a settlement there. Players can only place cities by upgrading settlements. If they build a development card, they can play it on their next turn. Players can only play 1 development card per turn. Each card has instructions on it. But one of the most common and important cards is the Knight. The Knight allows players to move the robber to any terrain hex and steal a resource card of their choosing from the owner of an adjacent settlement or city. When a player plays a Knight, they place it face up in front of them and leave it there. It stays in place for the remainder of the game. If a player has more than 3 knights in front of them at any point of the game, and they have the highest number of knights, they get the largest army card. This card is worth 2 victory points. Play continues until one player gets 10 victory points and wins.